Okay then, let's have a look at tiling textures. Let's tile a few textures and we'll just run into some problems and figure out how to do this. And a couple of things you want to bear in mind. Let's start off with an easy one first. This should be recorded, by the way, so I'll upload this video this evening if all goes well. What do we need to do to tile a texture? So at the moment this texture does not tile. How do we make it tile, and what do we need to bear in mind when we're doing it? So this is actually just a JPEG this came from. So we'll work with a JPEG for now here. The first thing a tiling texture needs to be is square. That's because CG programs, whether they're things like Maya, Max, Blender, Houdini, or even whether they're games engines as well, they prefer, in fact, they pretty much insist upon square texture maps. The reason for this is it means that these square texture maps can be MIP mapped. And what a MIP map is it's like a lower resolution or a higher resolution version of your original texture. It means that one texture can hold several MIP maps. Now in a game, that means that the game doesn't load in the highest resolution version of the texture when the object is a kilometre away. It loads in a lower resolution version, so the overhead on the games engine is lighter, so it can actually run. But this also works even with renderers these days. Arnold supports MIP mapping, so it can generate various different levels of detail of texture, but the textures need to be square for it to be able to do all the maths and hidden technical stuff behind the scenes. So when we make a tiling texture, or we make any kind of texture really, we should be aiming for a square. When you start using Substance Painter, I don't know if you've started using that yet, I doubt it, maybe. But when you do start using Substance, you'll notice that all the outputs by default are square outputs. So what's the best way of getting a square straight, a perfect square straight away without having to do anything? Well, the crop tool is your friend. If you go to the crop tool up here, you could just go like that to kind of crop into it, but there are little presets up here where it says ratio. So if you bring this down, you'll see there's a 1:1 square. You click that, and instantly it's cropped in and made a perfect square version. So I don't need to guess. I know if I click OK on this, it's going to crop it and have an absolutely perfectly square image, which is what I'm going to do. So I've got a square image now. Now's the point where I've got to actually make this tile in all directions. You'll notice, actually, before I do that, maybe you'll notice that the lighting on this is really consistent and even, which is going to make our job a lot easier. We're going to tackle one in a moment that does not have consistent lighting, and so we have to literally relight some of that texture before we can hope to make it tile correctly. But this one's okay. This one's actually fairly evenly done. So the first thing we do, well, the first thing I always like to do is just make a copy of the layer, just in case I completely screw up, and at least I can go back to the one underneath. This is actually a fairly straightforward, easy task. I'm going to make sure I'm in, well no, it doesn't matter whether what mode I'm in at the moment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Filter, Other, Offset. And this brings up this little box just here with two sliders, one for the left, one for the horizontal, one for the vertical. You've got a bunch of different options just here as well. The important thing is that it's set to wrap around and not set to these two. Because what this is going to do is you move this slider by little amounts, it's going to shift, it's going to offset all the pixels. And it's going to wrap them around. So the ones that were on the left will then be on the right, and vice versa. So let's just, geez, this one's, there's the seam. It's so close it's difficult to see the seam, and sometimes this can happen. Sometimes you can be fooled into thinking this thing already tiles, but sometimes it's difficult to see when it's these kind of noisy, granular kind of textures. But there, I don't know if you can see that. If you can see that on the streaming part, or whether it shows up, it probably doesn't show up particularly well on this rubbish projector. So I'd recommend maybe looking at the streaming to see this. There is a seam that's running down the middle of the image there. This is where the old left and right are left and right of the image used to be, but now we've wrapped them around, and now that left and right are in the middle of the image. So what we can do is we can go OK, and we can clone out now. We can use the cloning tool in Photoshop to get rid of this seam. So the clone brush, or the clone stamp tool as they call it, is just here. It looks like a little old-fashioned little ink stamp thing. So you click that. Now be careful it's not set to pattern stamp tool, because that does a different thing. You just need to click and hold on this, or hold Shift and S to switch between the two different modes. We want it in this mode, the mode without the little checkerboard. Now the way the clone stamp tool works is you define an area of the image that you want to use as a source, and then you paint that source on to other parts of the image. And the way we define the source is we hold down Alt, it turns into a little crosshair, and we pick a bit, maybe just here with the left mouse button. Now when you move across, you can actually see that ghostly playing over the top. You can see what's going to end up being stamped down. It's quite important that this is set to aligned. If this isn't set to aligned, it's going to constantly take that source from this spot here. It's not going to move that source up as our brush kind of moves up at the same time. So with that selected, I'm just going to, this is normally, I mean, it's not a deal breaker about how you do this necessarily, but I've found in the past that this tends to work quite well, is if you make a kind of slightly wavy line as you do this. You don't need to do it all in one go. So as you do that, you're essentially getting rid of that seam. That seam disappears. Now again, it's going to be impossible to see on the projector and everything, but if you're looking at it on the streamed view, you'll see it. I run into some problems when I get up near to the top, because it begins to grab sections of the image that are actually slightly off the top, so I get another seam coming in. So I've just got to, when it comes to the top, select another part a bit lower down and just finish that bit up there. So I can do that. So I've kind of got rid of the seam that runs down the middle of the image. So now I've done that, I can go to Filter, Other, Offset, and it's going to remember that value you put in the last time, so it's going to effectively cancel that out. So now we're back to the original image. I'm going to do exactly the same, but for the vertical. But not before I have a sip of coffee. So I'm going to shift this down. Okay, I can see the edge is just there. Yeah, there it is. There's the edge. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but instead of going like that, I'm going to go like this. So where's the edge? There it is. So I'm going to click there and here, and I'm going to make a sort of wavy kind of pattern as I go across. Like that. I think we're okay just there. Where I can see, I still see a little bit of a seam, so I'm just going to get rid of it like that. So now when I filter and offset this, I'm going to put this actually back down to 0. This should be now a perfectly tiling image. How do you test? What's the quickest way of testing this other than loading up Maya, making a model, sticking it on a model and putting tile on? Well, you could do it this way. You could select the whole thing with Control A, and you could go to Edit, Define Pattern, and call this, I don't know, my first tile. Click OK. So you've made a pattern out of the whole image. Now what you can do is down here in your layers, you can create a new solid. Doesn't have to be, it can be any color at all, it doesn't matter. And then on that solid, you could apply an FX pattern overlay. And this will bring up this menu box, and you get to choose your pattern down here. And there's that one we just created just there. Now by default, that's scaled at 100%. So you're just seeing it exactly how it looked before. But if we shrink this down now, it begins to tile. And hopefully you can't see, if you've done it right, you can't see a nasty ugly seam line happening. Hello? Yeah, no worries, I'll do that again. Following along, I like it. So, did you get to the point where you created, oh yeah, I can see the solid colour. Oh no, that's my screen you're looking at. Okay, remember, this is being videoed, so Don't worry about if you lose track for a little bit. So I've got this solid colour, and on that solid colour I'm going to go to FX, that little FX button, pattern overlay, which brings up this. You can just ignore everything here, don't need to worry about that. Don't need to worry about anything other than the actual pattern itself, which if you click that little arrow, you can select that new one that I just made. And then use the scale. And all we're doing, we're not using this to make a pretty image or anything like that. All we're doing is we're using this to see whether it's tiling correctly or not. Now, you can have the most perfect tiling texture in terms of getting rid of that seam, but the more you tile an object, the smaller that, not an object, the more you tile that image, the smaller that image becomes, the more you're going to see repeating patterns, no matter how good you're tiling. So you get really little, you can see the repeating little speckles, and that's going to become more and more apparent the more that there is detail, the more there is contrasty detail in your original texture. Now, there's limited ways of getting around this. I mean, you can do an absolute, as I said, you can do a perfect elimination of seams, but if you've got, say, one of these speckles is blue and all the others are white, you're going to quickly see that blue speckle. But you'd be amazed, though, how subtle a difference it can be. A pattern. What I did was, there's a little FX, can you see when my cursor's hovering around? Yeah. That FX button, if you click that, there's a pattern overlay just here. Yeah. And you click that, this comes up, and you can change your pattern just here. Of course, this is dependent on the fact that you've already created a pattern. That's what I'm saying. The way you create a pattern is on a layer, you select it, Control A, that selects everything, and then you go to Edit, Define Pattern. And you can give it a new name if you want, it doesn't matter, it's not going to break it. Then Photoshop's going to store that pattern behind the scenes, and you can use it later in loads of different ways. Again, don't worry too much about following along step by step. You can watch the video later as well. I just want this to kind of seep into your conscious and your subconscious. So anyway, sorry, just to get back to this important thing about no matter how good your tiling is, if one of these little chips in this asphalt is, you know, significant, well, not even significantly, even subtly a different value, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb the more you tile it. So there's a limited amount you can do in terms of making absolute 100% always going to work in every situation tiles. To get rid of repeating stuff happening, you'll often have to combine a tiled texture, maybe more than one tiled texture, and then you'll have to blend between the two in Maya or Houdini or Max, whatever you use. And then you might also start to need to use decal textures. These are kind of individual little textures that you lay on top so that that can further hide the seam. But just be aware that it's going to be very difficult to absolutely perfectly tile something, so that when you do check the tiling, it just looks completely brilliant no matter how small you make that tile. The goal here is to even out lighting and to make sure that the edges of the image are seamless. So that's that one. Let's just do another one. Just do another one and see how that goes. So I've got a few up here on Blackboard. That was texture 1. Let's do... Oop, I don't want to move that. Let's go into practice material and let's load up the other texture, texture 2. Takes a while to load, doesn't it? Okay, right, so let's copy this and put it into Photoshop. So I just right clicked and went copy image, and when I go to new in Photoshop, it's going to remember the image dimensions, which is really handy. And I'm going to Control V just to paste that in there. First thing I'm going to do again is I'm going to duplicate that layer just in case I mess up. And what I need is I need to crop it to be a square. So I click the crop tool. It's going to remember that I had square from last time, so I don't have to do anything there. I can look at this and I can go, well, maybe, you know, maybe I want it, you know, a smaller square. Maybe I want it in a different position. So you can make that decision there. But the important thing is it's going to be a perfect square crop, which is what we want. Okay, so I'm going to do something like that. Not too important. So again, first thing I'm going to do, filter, offset, like that. So this time I'm going to tackle the vertical pixels first. So I'm going to look carefully. I can see the seam is there, running across the line. So I want to bring that down to roughly halfway. You could do them both at the same time, to be honest. And let's do that. Let's deal with the vertical and the horizontal at the same time. So I'm also going to shift the horizontal. So hopefully after a while I can see the seam here. This is it. I mean, sometimes it's really difficult to see the seam. I'll be damned if I can see it. I'm thinking it's maybe there. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, I'm going to say it's just there. Okay, so go OK. Make sure we've got our clone brush activated. Let's do the horizontal line first. So it's going to click there and then go wavy line. Click here, do that bit, and then I'm going to do the vertical. So I'm going to click here. Now, you can make this more refined, you can make it better, depending on what the original texture is, by not using a default soft fuzzy kind of brush that does run the risk when you're dealing with texture that's got some little sharp, hard little angular shapes. It runs the risk of potentially softening that up and it being more noticeable when you tile. So the way you can get around that is to potentially use, well, you can use any brush at all you can use with this clone brush. So you can use a textured brush instead, and that might give you a better look when it comes to dealing with textures that have got some sharp edges in them as opposed to a soft edge. So I've done the vertical and horizontal, so let's reset that offset by just essentially just applying it again like that. Let's make a pattern out of it. Control A, edit, define pattern, my second tile. Click OK, and let's do that little test again. So I'm going to make a solid. I'm not really bothered about the colour of it at all, and then I'm just instantly going to go straight to that FX, go pattern overlay, and select my new one, this one just here, and then just shrink that down a bit. There we go. Again, I'm using quite forgiving textures in some ways because it was difficult to see the scene to begin with. But again, what you can see is you can run into the problem of seeing the same repeated segments of the texture, which is why you would end up using more than one texture and laying them up. Okay, so we did that one. Let's tackle something much more, well, significantly more difficult. And this will also allow me to use the camera raw as well. So sometimes, let's go down to, I think it is this one here. Okay, so this is downloading. It's not displaying the image because this is a camera raw image instead. So obviously it's also much, much bigger. It's 18.8 megabytes. What we're going to look at now is how to deal with lighting inconsistency when it comes to making a tile in texture, which I imagine is going to be the key thing you're going to run into when you're using your own textures. Okay, so how do we load this? Okay, we load it just via Photoshop, except it's going to load it into Camera Raw first. So we go to Open, Downloads, and it's this one here, P105, etc., etc. Let's have a look. And it's opening it in the other window. So this is Camera Raw, and it's identified the type of camera and the type of RAW format that's been used to shoot this. Now, you look at this, this is a part of a bathroom floor. It's square, so that's okay. We're in the right ballpark in terms of the right ratio, but hopefully you can see on the projector and on your streaming screens that it's significantly lighter up here than it is down here. So if I just opened this image now and didn't do anything at all to it, and if I made a pattern out of this image and then tiled it, now even if I perfectly got rid of these seams, you can see there's a really, it looks, when you're looking at it at 100%, it looks like a subtle lighting change. But when you see it tiled, you see it's really quite extreme. Trying to get rid of this lighting change using only the clone brush is not going to be fun, and it's not going to give you the best kind of result, because you're going to end up using such an enormous amount of cloning that it's going to become very fuzzy and indistinct. We need to sort of cancel out this lighting before we even get to the texturing part of it. So I'm going to quit at that, and I'm going to reload it back into RAW to show you what Camera Raw can do to help you with that. So just load it up again. So Camera Raw lets you change the white balance after the fact, and that stuff is just here. It allows you to change all the exposure, blah 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 blah. You've got lots and lots and lots of different settings. Each one of these sliders will do it to the whole image. But you've got some handy stuff up here that lets you do it in only selected parts of the image or in graduated parts of the image. And that's actually what we're going to use. We're going to use a gradient to kind of compensate, because it looks like the light is lighter up here and sort of fairly gradually but evenly gets darker down in this corner. So in Camera Raw, there's this thing here called a graduated filter. When you click that, you get a little crosshair, and automatically it kind of puts in a little value into the exposure. So if we drag a line down, left mouse button click and drag a line down just here towards the corner in roughly the direction that the light goes, which is sort of from here to here, what it's doing is it's applying this exposure compensation, but it's applying it across this gradient kind of line. So where it's at green, it's giving me half a stop extra exposure, and then it's gradually fading off to no change down at red. I kind of want it to be the opposite way around. I want it to be darker at the top to match up with the darkness down here. So I'm actually going to change this slider and begin to move it into the negative values like this, so that it begins to look a little bit more consistently even. There are a couple of ways in RAW that you can see how you're going, because it can be difficult to judge exactly how well you've done when you're just looking at it like this. This little Y button down here, if you click that once, you'll see a before and after on either side like this. What I find more useful is when you click it again, you see it literally sort of butted up against each other. That way you can get a better feel for whether this now looks like a more consistent and even kind of lighting. And I'm going to say, yeah, it does. It does look more consistent. So I'm going to be happy with that and go to Open Image. So it's going to, remember, it's not doing anything to the pixels here. All Camera Raw is doing is essentially generating a list of instructions to apply to the image as it sends it to Photoshop. So I'm going to go to Open Image. And that's what it looks like now. So it's probably going to tile a bit better already. Let's have a look. So if we Control A to select everything, and we just go to Define Pattern again, and again go to here, and let's create another solid, and put another pattern overlay over it with our latest version, and let's tile this down. Oh, that's a fair bit better. Now you can still see a difference here. This is almost to do with it's a little bit more saturated down in this bottom corner than it is in the top corner, but it's a lot better than it was last time, and you could probably add a push, work on that and tile it to make it look like it was seamless. But we can go one step further. Let's get rid of this. We can help eliminate the lighting difference even more by duplicating this layer. So you can duplicate a layer either by dragging it to the new little layer button here, or you can hold down Alt as you move something. Oh, you can't because it's locked. So if you unlocked it, you could. So there's a couple of ways you can create a new copier layer. or you can right click it. I think you can do duplicate layer. What I want to do though is I want to duplicate the layer, and straight away the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the opacity down to 50, like that. And you think, well, that doesn't do anything at all. A 50% opacity version of itself on top of itself, as I hide and unhide it, you can't see any difference at all. What we're going to do though is we're going to, with this layer active, we're going to select it and we're going to flip it both in horizontal and on the horizontal and on the vertical, by going to edit, transform, flip horizontal, and then transform, flip vertical. Now what this does, now you will be able to see a difference. This further evens out the lighting, because again it takes the lighting from opposite sides of the image, and at 50% normal opacity sort of blends them over the top. So it's going to even out that lighting even more. Now there is a downside to this. By doing this you do lose some visual information. It does become a little bit more hazy and indistinct, but flipping that background again to a positive side is that then that almost actually helps us eliminate some of that noticeable tiling that will happen later. So now we've done that, let's just merge these two layers to make this a single layer, and let's do the offset thing again. Other, offset. So I just want to shift this down so I can see the seam. I think the seam is bound to be there, but it's very, very close to being seamless already by doing that that trick of duplicating a layer and doing it at 50% opacity. So let's click OK and do our clone stamp thing again. Let's make it bigger. Click there, and then in a wavy line go across here. Maybe select there when you do this bit, and do the same here. Maybe make this a bit bigger actually to get rid of that noticeable dark spot. Got to be careful of that seam becoming visible. Maybe just there. So there we go. Let's define a pattern. And let's test it. Pretty good. But again, even then, you see, even with a featureless kind of texture, you get too small and you can start seeing that banding kind of happening. It's something you've got to be aware of. Okay, let's do one more. Maybe the most difficult kind of one you could do, but once you realise how to tackle it, not as difficult as you might think. So these are all very even, consistent. I mean, they might be textured in terms of this is marble and this is asphalt, but they're kind of even. They're noisy. You can't see much in the way of repeating patterns. What if you wanted to make a brick wall texture perfectly? You've kind of got to do a similar thing. You just got to be a bit more creative. You've got to almost think. You've got to think, be the texture. Right. So first things first. Again, we have to make sure that this is square. So I'm going to go back to my square crop. I don't want. If you notice at the top here, these bricks at the top of this original texture are actually, they must be like the top of the wall, and they're not the same kind of bricks as that are in the middle. You can also see that the whole photo has been taken at a slightly squiffy angle. This is another thing that you'll probably realise quite quickly with your own textures that you've shot. But we can still work with this. So if I shrink this in, what I'm also looking for is the effect of half an amount of bricks at the top and half an amount of bricks at the bottom, so that I can kind of attempt to align them up. But I might need to crop into this a little bit more severely, or hunt for the best spot. Let's try that. Okay, this might not work. Bear with me. Right. So we've got this. We're going to try and make this tile. This has got some problems as well. I can also show you another little technique for evening out lighting. Even though it's less to do with the lighting here, it's more that some bricks are slightly different coloration than other bricks. how do we make this texture? It's going to be almost impossible or really painful to do using the clone brush alone, because you're going to have to trace around each individual brick part. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to offset it. So I get that bit, and I get this bit running across here. You can see how different the colour tone of the bricks is between these two sides, that you don't necessarily see when you first look at the raw texture. So let's do that. And let's also duplicate. No, I'm not going to duplicate it at the moment. I'm going to trust myself that I can do it. What we're going to do is we're going to use a patch of this brick to kind of patch over the seam line, but we're going to make that patch of bricks, we're actually going to trace the contours of that bricky kind of shape, so it hopefully won't be as recognizable. So I'm going to go to the polygonal lasso tool, and I'm going to start off here, maybe here actually. I'm going to trace over, not too, but I don't have to be too precise here, but I just need to be getting the mortar, you know, the bits in between the bricks. What I want to do is I want to have a slightly irregular looking trace of these bricks. Something like that, maybe. Let's go, and then we're going to go to here, and I'm going to trace around these ones as well. But I don't have to be too precise here, I just need to be rough. Like that. Now I'm going to move this bit and shuffle it over to here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to copy it. So I'm going to go to, I'm going to either tap V or tap this little move tool here. Now with the move tool, if you hold down Alt, it turns from a little pair of scissors to two little arrows, and that means it's going to copy it rather than cut it, and we do want to copy it, not cut it. So I'm going to shift this over here, and I'm going to hold down Shift as well, although it's not absolutely essential you hold down Shift, but if you hold down Shift it will lock it. See, I'm moving up and down, but it's locking it to the horizontal. So I'm going to move it over and cover up this gap just here. We'll try that again actually. Go. I've got snapping on actually, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn snapping off here. This can sometimes mess with you as you're trying to move something freehand. That's better. So I'm going to move it like this so it covers up there, and deselect. Now already that's actually not too bad. It's quite kind of chameleon like, it kind of blends in quite nicely and evenly. But actually no, I've done it wrong. I'm going to do it slightly differently. I'm going to copy this. Apologies, I'm going to copy this. So I'm going to right mouse button and go layer via copy. Now I'm going to move it across to here. So you should see something like that. Now, at first glance, it's not too bad, but there is rough stuff happening here. Now, the way we can sort of soften that roughness off is create a layer mask for this layer that we've just done. So you do a layer mask by clicking this little button. Where it's white, your texture is going to show on this layer. Where it's black, your texture is not going to show. And anywhere in between is going to have varying degrees of opacity. So you can go into the brush, choose a soft round brush, make it, I don't know, relatively, make it about that size, switch to black, and when I'm painting on this layer mask, not when I'm painting on this bit, when you see these little highlights around here, that means you're painting on this thumbnail, you're painting on the texture itself. But if you click the mask, that means you're now painting into the mask. So if I go into here now, I can lightly dab, and it's going to blend between the layer above and the layer below. And this might help you get rid of some seams. Now, it's not going to do it perfectly, and after a while you're going to start revealing some of the errors that show up. But again, this is why this is the most difficult one to do. You've got it to this point. Now what you do is you create another layer on top. Now's where you go to the clone brush, get quite small, make sure that it's sampling not just the current layer, but the current layer it's sampling all layers, like this. And you zoom in, and you find your troublesome little points, and you do a sample, and you begin to tidy it up just there, like that. Do things like that. You're almost recreating the bricks. But if you were to try and use the clone brush right from the get-go on bricks, you might find it's a lot trickier, and you end up with results that look too soft. So you do that. Now I'm going to skip ahead because I'm not going to do all of it because it's going to take too long, and it's dragging on anyway, and there's a limit to how much you can sit through and look at. But I just want to show you one more thing. I'm going to collapse all these layers. I'm going to merge them, Control E. So once you've done everything, once you've dealt with this side and then that side, and then done the top and the bottom as well, you want to merge all your layers by selecting them all and doing Control E, or right mouse button click and do, if you select 2 layers, right mouse button and go merge layers. I like Control E. Right, how do you, let's just talk about how we could possibly change the lighting values here. So say you've done everything and you've done it really well, you've done absolutely perfect seamless tiling, but that lighting value is still playing up. Now we looked at the way that Camera Raw can do it, but there's another way you can do it as well. You can take your layer, duplicate it, and then you can again go to Filter, Other, but this time go to High Pass. And high pass is useful for lots of different reasons, and lots of different uses, and we'll look into them as time goes on. But if we do quite a large value on high pass, maybe something between 60 and 80, you get this weird anemic, kind of ill, sickly looking result. If you click OK and you change its blending mode from normal to luminosity, what it does is it kind of evens out a lot of the lighting. Can you see how it looks more identifiably splotchy before than after? This high pass trick is worth the price of admission to this lecture alone, because it's a great way of cancelling lighting out in general. Guaranteed, if any of you have taken your texture stuff of like something like shiny garage doors or something like that, that's when you're going to really notice horrible lighting differences all across the image. Try running it through this high pass trick to cancel out some of that lighting, and then thank me later. So that's how you do that. So yeah, that's about it. So we've tackled fairly straightforward, easy peasy stuff. We tried something that had really obvious crazy lighting differences and came from Camera Raw, and we used the Camera Raw plugin or filter to deal with it, and we looked at a way of cancelling out lighting by duplicating the layer, 50% opacity, and then flipping it horizontally and vertically. And then finally we looked at how to tackle bricks, which is a little bit more involved, but still totally doable and not too difficult. You just got to know how to tackle it. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a whole bunch of those textures that you took. I think we probably took them on week 1 and week 2, and I think I sort of steered you towards beginning to take pictures that you could use as textures and tile. I want you to try and tile those photos that you took and post them up to the forum. When you post them up to the forum, obviously they don't have to be Camera Raw. I want them to just be JPEGs. But yeah, that's going to be your task for the rest of the day or the rest of the session, and any directed study kind of homework is to complete that as well. And I should point out that this tiling textures now is going to be part of the assignment. So it's a requirement for you to do this part. There's no deadline for it as such at the moment, but if you accidentally forget about doing the tiling textures at the end of semester 2 when I'm marking it and you haven't got the tiling textures in there, that's going to be a hefty percentage drop in marks if you've forgotten about it. So my advice would be just do it now while it's fresh in your mind, and I'm here to help. Okay, cool. Thanks everyone.